Larry Chin, Esquire, will present the ins and outs of immigration law. Mr. Chin has been an attorney for the past 24 years, practicing exclusively in U.S. immigration and nationality law. He has represented hundreds of clients before immigration courts all over the country and on appeal before the Board of Immigration Appeals, and then in federal circuit courts. His work also includes employment and family-based visas, which are adjudicated by the Citizenship and Immigration Services and the United States Embassies and Consulates. In 1921, Mr. Chin became the Legal Services Director for Kitsap Immigration Assistance Center. This is referred to as KIAC. At first I thought KIAC was a boat, but if you see the initials, it's KIAK. This is in Bremerton. And after he became one of the director, after serving several years on the board of directors. The KIAC mission, in recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of all people, works for the well-being and empowerment of immigrants through education, advocacy, and social justice. Specifically, KIAC offers free or low-cost business, family, and legal services to immigrants in the local community. Let's give a warm welcome to Larry Chin.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone, for coming out, and for those of you on the internet, welcome. Before I begin, I'd like to take a little survey. Do we have any members of any Native American tribes here? For the record, no one's raising their hands. It raises an interesting point. I was in Alaska a couple years back, and I walked into an art gallery, and the Native American artist there looked at me sideways. He asked me a question. He said, "Are you Native?" I said, "Native to China." Which is to say, we're all immigrants here. And the patterns of human migration are constant, and not before the formation of nation states was not dictated by laws and rules, just maybe where the herds went, maybe where there were bountiful harvests. And so what motivates people to move to the United States, or any country for that matter, the motivations aren't any different than maybe what your ancestors faced, maybe what you faced, or maybe the reasons why you came here. So tonight I wanted to give you a brief overview of US immigration law and policy, and give you a sense of how it plays out in today's world. And with specific examples, with some of the work that we do at KIAC in representing the most vulnerable populations in our area. So the topic that I want to talk a little bit about is not my own. I am taking it a little bit from an article written for the Brookings Institute entitled "U.S. Immigration Policy, a Classic Unappreciated Example of Structural Racism," written by Charles Kamasaki. United States, in the United States Congress, in one of the first acts, one of the first immigration laws it passed was in 1790. And it passed a law that allowed individuals to apply for naturalization, to become US citizens. The standard to become a US citizen was, quote, to be a free white person of, quote, good moral character. And maybe they had to separate out those two, because being a white person maybe didn't lend itself to be a person of good moral character naturally. We'll leave it to those founders to discuss. But what that meant by implication was that it excluded Native Americans, Blacks, arguably women. In 1882, this is my favorite, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, specifically excluding members of the Chinese population from coming to the United States. It led to an entire underclass of Chinese laborers in this country who didn't have wives, didn't have their own sort of support networks. Interesting side, talk about the rise of Chinatowns. throughout this country and what they brought to this country. In 1924, there was a national origins quota set in place. In the 1930s, there was a Mexican Repatriation Act on the heels of the Great Depression, forcing Mexican laborers to leave. In 1935, there was a rule limiting the number of Filipinos in this country, 50 per year. That's like one family weekend gathering around here, 50 Filipinos per year. 1956, Operation Wetback resulted in the deportation of 1.3 million Mexicans. In 1960, they eliminated the Bracero program, which was a program to bring temporary labor into the United States. In 1996, Congress passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, which overhauled the entire system of immigration law, created this concept of unlawful presence. Now, unlawful presence was a concept. Unlawful presence is defined as being in the United States essentially without status or doing something in violation of your visa status. And if you have accrued a certain period of unlawful presence and subsequently departed to the United States, then you are subject to a bar of inadmissibility anywhere from 3 to 10 years. Now, in abstract, you think, well, that's fair. We don't want to reward or we want to punish people who don't treat outboarders fairly, that jump across the border back and forth, back and forth. But in practice, really who it affects most are Latinos and Mexicans in particular. Because in my experience, in the past 24 years, my clients who come from other countries other than Latin America, they're coming from Asia, they're coming from Africa. Once you come to the United States, it's often a very expensive, very dangerous proposition. These people are not going back for Christmas or Tet or the New Year. So the effect of this law in 96, 97 was when it was enacted, or IRA, was effectively discriminatory on its face. U.S. immigration law and policy, the purpose of our system of rules is by its definition to limit the number of people who want to come to the United States, which is a reasonable assumption. We have limited resources, we have finite numbers of jobs is what the argument is. And so the laws that we have created in place now are a way of limiting the amount of people who come to the United States. Now, I want to be fair here. There have been a number of specific pieces of legislation that have targeted national groups that have benefited specific groups depending on which country you're from. For example, there was a special agricultural legalization, or SAW, in 1986, benefiting agricultural workers, predominantly Latino in nature. There was the Chinese Student Act, Legalization Act in 1992 on the heels of the Tiananmen Square massacre, benefiting certain Chinese students in this country, allowed them to get their green card status here. There is something called NACARA, which was reserved primarily for people from Central America. And so it's not fair or accurate to say that all of our laws are entirely prejudicial towards one particular group. Which brings us to the present day. So in order to get lawful immigration status in this country, you are trying to get a visa. Visa is also, people call them green cards or permanent residency. In Spanish, they're called micas. So every year, Congress allocates a certain number of visas that can be given to different people throughout the course of the year. Now, there are two big major groups for these visa allocations. There are visas that are for family-based immigration, and then there are visas for employers who are looking to sponsor their workers to get their green cards that way. And if you were to look at the current number of visas being made available, the number of visas available per year for family-based immigration, 226,000 per year. And this visa category covers the adult, unmarried children, and married children of U.S. citizens, spouses of lawful permanent residents, minor children of lawful permanent residents, adult unmarried children of lawful permanent residents, and siblings of U.S. citizens. This quota does not apply to immediate relatives. So there is an unlimited number of visas available to immediate family members. Immediate family members are spouses, parents of U.S. citizens, and minor unmarried children of U.S. citizens. So if you fall in any of those groups, you're not subject to any of these preferential visa categories. Now, in the employment side, so let's say I'm a company that wants to sponsor my worker for a position. There are 280,000 visas available per year. So really, I would have you think about it conceptually as actual visas. So here I am, US government, I have visas to give out every year. At the beginning of each year, incidentally, begins October 1st. So we're about to come into a new fiscal year with a replenishment of these visas. US government, by delegation through the US State Department is the one that keeps track of these visas. They're in charge of allocating visas. So depending on who you are, what your skill level is, you may or may not get a visa. And by law or regulation, I'm not sure, I didn't have a chance to research this, we can only give 7% of employment-based visas per nationality or per country group. And so what that translates into is something that you may have heard of, which is extended backlogs for visa availability. And as far as employment-based categories, it matters greatly whether you are Chinese, Indian, Mexican, or Filipino. These countries are what is called are oversubscribed. And so if I am a similarly qualified, similarly credentialed, similarly experienced software engineer, for example, but I happen to have been born in China, even if I was US educated, even if I got my PhD at MIT here, I am still subject to a waiting period, unlike someone from anywhere else in the world. So right now, for example, if I have a master's degree or better, or a bachelor's degree and 5 years of appropriate experience, if my case was filed by my employer on or before October 1st, 2019, today, August 2022, I can get one of these visas. If I'm Indian, that wait is if my case was filed December 1st, 2014. So there is a 5-year gap between China and India. If I'm from anywhere else in the world, there's no wait. Now we talk about America being a country of meritocracy. Yet this system of laws does not reflect that in the least. And if we were to hold true to the argument that 7% caps for distribution of these visas is consistent with our idea of diversity, then how does it reconcile with what our country's population currently is? For example, according to the 2020 census, the United States is 57% white. That doesn't translate into the diversity argument. If you wanted to diversify the country, you would allow more of these visas to other nationals, particularly Chinese and Indian. And there was an economic argument here. Oftentimes, when I've done work in the private sector, many of my clients that I consult with have gone to school here. They've built lives here. They have their kids here. They've been here a long time waiting for their visas. They want to go out and start businesses. They want to maybe change employers. And there are some rules about transferability of employment-based visas. You're not stuck to an employer necessarily, but sometimes you can be. But your spouse is limited in their options to get work authorization, for example, limited in their career advancement because of the bureaucracy, because of the delays that are associated with visa preferences. Now, this is relevant because as of 2 weeks ago, August 9th, President Biden and Congress passed something called the CHIPS Act, $260 billion tax package of credits for the purpose of growing and sponsoring silicon chip production in the United States. One of the proposals as part of the negotiation in the CHIPS Act was to eliminate this preference categories. Did not pass. Did not pass. Family-based cases, give you a different example. If I am trying to sponsor, let's say I have a adult, let's say I'm a permanent resident and I want to sponsor my unmarried adult child. If I'm coming from China or anywhere else in the world, if I had filed that petition, if I had the foresight or the ability to go back in time and file a petition for them, as of January 1st, 2017, as of today, that visa is available. I'll say it again. If I had filed 5 years ago for my adult unmarried child overseas, they would have a visa available today. They could start the process to obtain that visa to enter the United States. Now, if I happen to be Filipino, that time period goes back to October 1st, 2013. If I happen to be Mexican, August 8th, 2001. You do the math. So oftentimes when I'm consulting with clients and I'm talking to them, figure out where they're from. And by the way, I should distinguish here that for purposes of this preference category, it does not matter where your citizenship is. What matters is where your place of birth is. So if I was born in Mexico, but ultimately get a UK passport, I am still treated as a Mexican. So it's a little bit of a sense of why when we talk about structural and inherent systematic racism, these are examples that are written into statute and play out every day, and they affect the lives of our clients at KIAC and my clients elsewhere and their families and their abilities to be reunited. It stymies entrepreneurship. It limits how much investment people want to make here because of the uncertainty and how long it takes to get a visa. So this is all very good and abstract and historical point of views and empirically. But how does that really translate in today's current events? You may be aware that in August of last year, the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. There's been a lot of news about this. And in the wake of the US departure, there were many of our allies in Afghanistan that were left holding the bag. In fact, KIAC, we have 2 clients from Afghanistan. We are preparing for interview at the asylum office next week. And you should hear their stories. Stories of adversity and stories of perseverance. Just heroic. You also are aware that there's a war in the Ukraine. And so these are 2 sort of international crises that the United States has been participant to in one way or another. But the question is, how were these 2 crises and these nationals treated relative to one another? So if you're an Afghan, you have to apply, go through a process to request parole. There's a fee involved. There's a waiting. There's vetting. Ukrainian, no fee, less of a wait. What's the common denominator? Is it enough to reduce it to politics? I think I would argue that we have just as much at stake in Afghanistan as we do in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Is it race? What have we seen historically? I'll give you another example of how this plays out. Last week, we had a client, I had a client that we took to trial defending her in deportation and removal proceedings in Seattle, Washington. This woman is very typical of many of KIAC's clients, hailed from Guatemala. Guatemala is about 60% indigenous. So when I asked the question earlier about that's a different conversation. But this lady is being persecuted on account of her indigenous status. The fact that she's from Guatemala didn't speak Spanish. Persecution by what indigenous Guatemala was. Her claim was based in part because she was indigenous, in part because of her religion. But the way our system of laws are set up is at her first encounter at the border, she was brought into an interrogation room. And this is an interrogation. There is a Border Patrol officer who is holding her against her will and asking for questions. Use of the Spanish translator. And there are details to her story that were listed in the transcript. She didn't have the benefit of a modern translator. She didn't even have the benefit of a review of what was written in the question and answers. It was just listed based on what she had said. And when asked, do you speak Spanish? The answer is yes. When it was clear to me in the preparation of her for trial, she spoke very little Spanish. We had to have a mom translator every time we spoke with her, just to be sure, because these are very complicated cases that can live and die on a mere term or mere fact. And any bit of inconsistency will be used against you, particularly if you have an unkind, impatient, uncompassionate judge, or incompassionate, a judge without much compassion or patience, which is what we encountered. And unfortunately for her, by the time her file reached my desk, her story had gone through multiple iterations. And it wasn't perhaps intentionally malicious, but her story was, the timeline was poor. It didn't make any sense. It didn't have any internal coherence. And one of the hardest parts of qualifying for something like asylum, for example, is demonstrating credibility. And if you can't speak credibly to your claim, you can lose your ability to remain in the United States for that reason alone, plain and simple. And if I could take you to the courtroom and give you the setting, here's this woman who's probably in her young 20s, no education, maybe first grade education at most, barely speaks any Spanish. We have a translator in place who is speaking Mom into Spanish, and then we have a Spanish-English translator. So you can imagine back in the day when you were a kid and you played that game telephone, and how much gets lost in translation. And then you have a government attorney whose job is it to prosecute this case, who's a trained attorney. All they do all day long is hear these cases, and they can find ways to poke holes into someone's story. And then you have a judge that's unsympathetic, whose job it is all day long is to sit here and pass judgment on people's credibility. How hard is it to derail some woman's case who has very little evidence to corroborate her claim? How do you get evidence to corroborate someone persecuting you? No one's gonna write you a letter that says, "Dear Indigenous lady, we intend to persecute you on account of your religion and because you're Indigenous." No one writes that letter. It's all based on credible testimony, background information that's contained within the record. And so this is a very real example of how the system is set up and stacked against clients that KIAC has. At KIAC, we offer some protection. I was talking to my colleague Kim, and in hearing a lot of the stories that our clients bring to us, they're very hard stories to hear. And it typifies and shows us that there's a lot of bad in this world, a lot of malintent for whatever reason, ignorance, hatred, prejudice. But at KIAC, we are countering that. We are a beacon of good for these people. And the bulk of the work that KIAC does is by the grace of volunteers. We have volunteers in all capacities. We have volunteers that represent clients in court. We have volunteers that take clients' cases, represent them before the immigration services. We have volunteers that will drive clients to interviews. We have volunteers that collect diapers. We have volunteers that deliver food, that will translate for clients, that will help clients take the naturalization tests, work on their English. And so if you are interested in any way of getting off the sidelines and helping your fellow neighbor in any way, come talk to us. We could use you. We could use you in this fight. I'm happy to answer your questions.
So when you're talking about Mexico, you're talking about Mexico. What about South America? Say like Bolivia. What about people who are immigrating or wanting to immigrate? Are they categorized as being Mexican?
No. No. These are country-specific designations. So Bolivians would be Bolivians. Now, there are some countries that have special entitlements because of their relationship with the United States, where they may or may not need a visa, and they would be subject to what's called the ESTA program, where you can just, oftentimes as American, we take for granted the ability to travel without having to first apply to a country's embassy to get a visa. And we have that agreement in reciprocity with other countries. I don't think Bolivia is one of them. I think Chile is one. For example, you can show up as a Chilean passport holder, come and visit, come to Disneyland. No, and often the equation is whether or not there's a political element, but it's really a socioeconomic argument. Is how likely is that person to return to their home country? How much history of prior immigration overstays are there? And those numbers and statistics are tracked. And so if Bolivia has a large history of people coming as tourists and then overstaying, then it becomes more difficult to get a tourist visa, for example. But, these larger, more industrialized Western white countries, not subject to visa requirements. Jill.
You said 7% per country group can come in. I wasn't sure whether it was 7% of the total that can come in or 7% of the population in that country.
7% of visa allocation.
Okay, so that China, for people in China, would get far less than people in Finland, for example.
It would be, so for example, the employment-based categories, 280,000 visas available per year, no more than 7% can go to Chinese, 7% to people from Finland.
So a much lower percentage of Chinese that are living in China can come here than Finland.
Well, sure, it's relative. It's not necessarily relative to the country's population, but it's relative to the number of people that can come here. Now, as it plays out in practice, the volume and the number of Chinese tech workers, for example, is much greater than from Finland. Like I don't even know if I've had a Finnish programmer, for example.
So obviously you've been doing this, you're an attorney. What are your suggestions for fixes in this? What have you seen, any positives? You've been through the Republican, Democrat administrations. Have you given some hope that there's something going on? Right.
I've been doing this long enough not to be optimistic. I'm not terribly sanguine about the possibility of reform. So I've been practicing since the Clinton administration. And the last major immigration reform that happened by statute was at the very tail end of the Clinton administration. It's called the Life Act in December of 2020. It was a minor extension of a qualified amnesty called 245I. And since then, if you looked at the history of immigration reform and amnesties, historically, they have gone much broader. The biggest one being perhaps under the Reagan administration, and subsequent administrations have narrowed that much smaller into smaller gaps or smaller groups. And frankly, I'm not sanguine about any possibility of Congress passing any real meaningful change of law. I mean, for example, we couldn't even settle on eliminating daylight savings. A Congress that is that dysfunctional, that divided, a country that is that polarized, and for an issue that is so incredibly politicized, particularly after the last president, it is a very tall ask. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been positive changes procedurally that have affected immigrants in a positive way. But if you're interested in knowing or making change, then talk to your legislatures. Spend time volunteering. Get out there and advocate for immigrants. I think one of the sharpest arguments we can make that is compelling across the board is an economic one. immigrants, there is a myth that immigrants take public, welfare. Not true. They're not qualified. You can't get welfare if you're not legal, if you don't have status here. It's a common myth that immigrants take more public benefits than native-born Americans. It's just not true. The reality is that immigrants provide employment. They're entrepreneurial. I'll give you an example. My family immigrated to the United States. My parents were immigrants. They didn't speak English, didn't have an education, worked very low-paying jobs, but they came to the United States to have the opportunity for their kids. My brother is a Secret Service agent. My sister's a doctor. My other brother is a vice president of a major bank. This is how our country works. We don't arrive maybe with a golden spoon, but maybe at some point we can give back and create that impetus moving forward.
For the benefit of everybody at home, Kimberly will be rephrasing your questions so we can capture the voice on the cell phone, right?
Right, but you're doing that. Do you have questions now? Ready?
There's no questions in the chat, but just so everyone in the chat can hear what the question was asked.
In the back.
So of the 7%, you said that hopefully Hispanics are allowed into the United States. Is it kind of like a first come first serve who's been waiting longer, or do some Hispanics that are applying for a visa get preferential? Like I'll put you in my shoes. I'm here because I want to come here and talk about this whole immigration stuff. I just got married July 16th because my wife was deported from Houston, Texas on a visa. So since we're about to start the process for a visa, because I'm an American citizen, does she get preferential over the other Hispanics who do not just have the same language?
Okay.
So just for
You get what I'm saying? You get what I'm saying?
the audience tuning in digitally, the question is for the 7% of Hispanics allowed into the United States, is there preferential treatment depending on certain types of cases? For example, the person asking the question has a spouse who is working on getting the process started to come into the United States. Does that sound like a accurate summary?
Okay, so to be clear, the 7% allocation or distribution of visa only applies to employment-based visas, not family-based, which is where your wife's visa would fall.
Okay.
And then in terms of Hispanics in preferential treatment and visa prioritization, the only group of Hispanics that are considered in this preference category would be Mexicans. So any other country is not subject to these preference categories. And then finally, if you are the spouse of a US citizen, then this finite number of visas doesn't apply to your spouse. There is an infinite number of visas available for those folks.
Oh, so I
Yeah.
don't have to be worried about her.
No, you don't.
200,000.
The visa prioritization, being available is not an issue in your wife's case. The fact that she's been deported is an issue. It's a real issue, and it's a real bar to returning.
Do you have any suggestions as to how we could limit immigration? Because there's between India and China, there's about 4 billion people, and they can't all come. So there's a lot of people who are deserving, but we can't take every single Chinese who wants to come, and we can't take every Indian who wants to come because there's so very many people there. How would you suggest limiting coming to America?
So just for everyone at home, the question is, how would Larry suggest an ethical way to limit those who are looking to enter the United States?
Well, if I could wave a wand and grant visas to people, how I would categorize it and I agree that there are limitations to resources. There are carrying capacity issues for each country to be able to absorb an infinite number of bodies and immigrants. But if you were to look at it purely from a merit-based system, for example, I would say at a minimum, if you've come to this country and you've gotten a master's or a PhD from one of our universities or institutions, easily verifiable, give them a green card. Don't make them wait. It only benefits us. It will move our country forward. If you look at countries that historically have limited immigration, like Japan, what do we have? 30 years of economic stagnation. And if you look at our country of Social Security and people paying into the system, you need bodies. We need people to run our economy. Everyone's going to have to do, there's still work to be done. Employment, 3%. Look at the people who pick your food, people who wash your clothes, do your landscaping. There's a demand here. They're not taking jobs from people that want a landscape. I'll tell you that. It's not true.
So what I'm trying to wrap my head around this, so that I agree with what you're saying about the PhDs and the masters, but I can volunteer work in Guatemala. I've seen some of the smartest people I've ever met who have no education. They are way smarter than all of us doctors that are there because they've had to survive under duress. So if you took those people and didn't give somebody without education, are they vying for the same 7%? Or they have a way to come in differently? Or they, you know what I'm saying? If you take all the people that are clearly wealthy enough to come here, some your tuition to go to MIT or Harvard or Yale, what about the people that had no opportunity because they're dirt poor, but they're smarter than those? Like, are they competitive because we've taken their spot?
I don't know if I can summarize this question.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, the question is, are there any other mechanisms for people who don't have traditional academic credentials to get U.S. valid immigration status?
And are they vying for the same spots that the PhD candidate would get?
By definition, no.
Because they have what other way to get it, what other visa?
Well, they would either have to find a qualifying family member, or we do have a system of law in place for asylees, people who are fleeing countries for qualified basis. Now, fleeing a country for economic reasons is not a basis for asylum. Fleeing a country where there is a war is not a basis for asylum. It is a well-established, articulated body of asylum law in this country, based in part in international law. Those folks, if they're fleeing persecution and qualify and can establish their cases, should qualify to get protection here and status here. And that is also a separate sort of conversation, and political conversation. So how we define asylum applicants is depending on which way the politics are blowing. So for example, there was a law that was by definition, in 1996, there was a statutory amendment that specifically defined people who had been subjected to coercive population control measures as qualifying for asylum. That's Chinese. And I have had hundreds of those cases. But that is a specific subgroup that was carved out in part because the administration in power at the time was very pro-life. And so that lobby pushed forth that idea and codified it. Now, another example is, so in order to be eligible for asylum, you have to have been persecuted on account of your race, religion, particular social group, or nationality, political opinion, if I haven't mentioned that already. And so the more squishy area is particular social group. And the way our system of jurisprudence is in this country is particular social group is defined in part by statute, but there's still a lot of fuzzy parts about how that's defined. And so up until the Trump administration, before we had Attorney General Sessions, for example, there was a body of law that had been established that found that women, for example, who were in domestic violence relationships qualified as a particular social group for purposes of asylum. Now, when Attorney General Jeff Sessions was installed, the first thing he did was he said, I've considered this, and this is the way immigration law works is the Attorney General has the ability to override the authority or decisions of immigration judges and the body above it called the Board of Immigration Appeals. Jeff Sessions, in a decision, a line of decision called Matter of AB, said specifically, you know what? This group, these women fleeing abusive relationships, no longer constitute a particular social group for asylum purposes. With the stroke of a pen, this entire group of women, predominantly, who were seeking protection, no longer covered, no longer protected. Fortunately, we had a reversal when Attorney General Garland was installed. He reversed that. But what does that say for the future? If that type of jurisprudence is so politicized that jurisprudence changes, any concept of precedent, any concept of stare decisis out the door. How do you plan for that? How do you make that calculated decision? It's impossible as an attorney. Can't imagine from a layperson's point of view how they would digest something like that.
How many of these people do you think are climate immigrants? They're fleeing from drought or harvest or heat, things like that. Is that a large percentage, do you think?
How many people are immigrating? How many people are immigrating due to climate considerations?
Let's take a survey. Anyone from California? I honestly don't know. I would imagine there's a fair number. If you go back to, if you look at historically instances of famine, for example, you remember the 80s when we saw all the starving Somalians and Ethiopians, you know, that's a function of climate change. And no judgment on people wanting to survive for whatever reason. And if they wind up in a different country because they are getting water there, it's a harder, I think, to get to the United States without those means. And that's why there's been such an emphasis on these migrant trains coming from Central America and why there's so much news on it. I don't know the number, but I suspect we're going to see more and more of that. Question?
Yeah, so in trying to follow your descriptions here, the people coming out of Ukraine are fleeing war. So what category are they in? I thought they were in the asylum group, and it doesn't sound like that their credentials, so to speak, asylum wouldn't be one that they could claim because they're fleeing a war, not the one listing UK. So how are they getting here?
What category are those fleeing the war in Ukraine fitting into, and how are they getting here?
So that is the beauty of immigration law, is they wouldn't fall within the traditional category. They are here because we said they could be here. We've done that historically. We've said that to our Filipino allies after World War II. You work with us, come here. If you were a translator in Iraq, I'm here. We can designate that. We can say and choose. Question is, what are those standards that set those guidelines? But I like the way you're thinking. Come volunteer for us. I've got some casework for you. Question.
Well, I appreciate the work you're doing. I'm a refugee myself. I immigrated with my family from Moldova in the early 90s. I wanted to kind of describe something I've been thinking about for a while. We came under long breaks where I was Jewish. So we were with those refugees. I've got a friend of mine who's about my same age, immigrated at the same time as I did, from like almost the same country in the Eastern Bloc. His parents never were able to get citizenship. They just recently got green cards, even though they resided in the States for a long time. He's the DACA recipient. I've always been wondering, since he's an adult now, is it possible for him to get citizenship in the United States, or is he still subject to that, the cap that we talked about?
This question pertains to DACA and whether or not it would apply in a specific immigration pathway.
Okay. I think I need to clarify this idea of preference category visas. I offer that as a way of demonstrating how our system is systematically set up to prioritize certain nationalities over others. That's just in general, these questions that we're fielding don't necessarily, the visa priority and preference and availability is not really part of that sort of conversation. But to your point, DACA is a great example. So in this country, there are kids and now adults, contributing members of society who were brought here to the United States as young children without their consent, very young age, didn't have any say in it, came with mom and dad, very sympathetic group of candidates. And by executive action, President Obama created the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, or DACA recipients. And then President Trump tried to eliminate that program because, again, it was a creation of executive authority. And so what we're seeing these days is, instead of having congressional legislative acts that would be subject to review constitutionally by the courts, now we're seeing action being put forth through executive fiat. And so depending on the administration, they can create these categories of protection. They can grant things like temporary protected status, which is something that Ukrainians get, something that Afghans get, Nepalese, Congolese, back in the day, Hondurans. The list goes on. We can designate who we want to offer relief to. And so specifically to your question, if you're here under DACA, DACA in itself is not a mechanism towards permanent residency. It is temporary in nature. It can be withdrawn and the rug pulled out from underneath you at any moment. Thankfully, Supreme Court said, President Trump, you can't do this, but on technical grounds. So that program can go away. And so when we talk about prospects for the future, you may have heard about the Dreamers or Dream Act. I'm hopeful for that. That would include a great number of different applicants, like your friend, give them eligibility. I think specifically you should have your friend reach out to us and we can talk to him. There are ways, because of the sort of circuitous way that DACA has developed and all the different ins and outs, there are some loopholes that are available now, particularly under the Biden administration, that weren't available to people under the Trump administration for DACA holders as a mechanism to get permanent residency. But the window is narrow, and for many clients, they don't know about it. It's a lot of immigration lawyers don't know about it, and it's not something that you come across. You're not going to find it on Google. Well, you might, but you'll get yourself in trouble sometimes. Dr. Google or Attorney Google.
What ways can community members get involved and support KIAC?
What ways can community members get involved and support KIAC?
I think being here is the first step. Hearing about the breadth of the issues and to know that these folks are in your community. They're the ones that are doing the living and dying, to use the old Jimmy Stewart line. You can come to KIAC in any capacity that you are willing to give us. We will take you in any form. If you want to volunteer 1 hour a week helping someone learn to speak English or boning up on their naturalization, if you want to come deliver presents around Christmas time, if you want to donate your time or your money or your used clothing or clean diapers, in any capacity, we will take you. We partner with local organizations. If you have a specific area that you want to work in, let's say you have some background in counseling, our clients are traumatized. We could use counselors. We could use people for clients just to talk to. If you have business expertise, there's a component of KIAC that we spend time helping clients prepare business licenses so that they can be with part of the system. They can pay taxes. We help clients file their quarterly taxes with the state. We help clients file their annual taxes. We want them integrated into the system to the extent that is possible. We want them to have a seat at the table. And if you have some expertise in running a small business, come talk to us. We can make you a special advisor to some of our clients.
So what percentage of your clients are Hispanic versus other groups? I mean, I guess I may be erroneously under the impression that it's primarily Hispanic or Mexican. That's not correct, is it?
So this question is asking for the demographic breakdown, specifically about ethnicity. of the clients that we see at KIAC. And our primary population that we serve is Guatemalan. And I think in a grant that I recently wrote, it was something like over 50%, like 56% were Guatemalan. And then for the rest of our breakdown, I don't think we had that as specifically, but Annika actually might know in the back, but I'm not sure.
So Annika is our Family Services Director. Kim is our Development Director. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Guatemalan, we primarily work in Guatemalan families, second would be Mexican families. So definitely there's lots of places, those are the three groups we see most. They come to our office. I think we have work to do building trust with some other emergencies, but for those that we're seeing.
So the answer from Annika, KIAC's Family Services Director, is in the order of, I guess, amount. It's Guatemala, Mexico, Philippines, and then, but we've helped clients from over 70 countries.
I talked to clients, as I mentioned earlier, we're preparing clients for interview from Afghanistan. We have a Ethiopian client. I met with a Ukrainian lady recently, family from Argentina. You'd be surprised at the diversity of countries that are represented in Kitsap County. And we get phone calls from all over the place. In terms of people that we actually serve, that's who we're talking about. But we get solicitations for help constantly. The demand is overwhelming.
So speaking of that, how hard is it to actually get in to get some services?
With KIAC,
Yes.
it can be challenging. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. The question was, how difficult is it to get in and receive services at KIAC?
It can be challenging, to say the least. We have a small paid staff that is in charge of processing and taking in new clients. You know, our primary obligation is to our existing clients. We have that relationship where we have an ethical obligation. And so at this point, I think we have something like 600 plus open immigration cases, 600 plus. But for the grace of all of our volunteers, we would never get that type of volume done. Most of these applications are affirmative filings, but there are some that are defensive ones, meaning we go to immigration court. There's a detention center down the road in Tacoma, so we often will be doing bond hearings, getting folks out. We just had a success story. We got, for some reason, a man was separated from his family. They were released. He was brought up here. His family was in Utah. One of our volunteers was able to do a bond hearing, got him out, released, put on a plane back home. And, you know, anything involving court in terms of our time and resources, it's just an incredible time suck in terms of how much resource and time is involved. So the woman whose trial I did last week, that was probably a good 25 hours of my time of the week. And I have limited time to administer what I need to administer and at the same time be an immigration lawyer. So it is challenging for sure. And we keep track of all the people calling us, and the volume of people looking for help, it just keeps growing, in part because we do such a good job for clients and we charge them practically nothing. So why wouldn't you want to come to us?
Do you have a referral list of local immigration attorneys that people can afford to pay normal fees?
Somewhat. We try not to advocate and say this attorney over the next attorney. But frankly, there aren't that many. I was in private practice in Seattle for 24 years. I know most of the immigration lawyers. There's not that many on this side of the water. You have to go to Seattle.
I'm curious if there is any sort of network or collaboration between immigrant assistance centers in different areas, or if we support each other, like the KIAC of Mason, the KIAC of Pierce, or the equivalent there. If there is to collaborate, you support each other, resources, references, referrals. I hate to think that we're on our own in our county. What supports do you all have? So this question is referring to how KIAC collaborates with other immigration or immigrant-centric organizations, and then also what other sort of partnerships and support do we have?
We work hand in hand with other providers whether they are providing immigration services or other family-based social services, counseling, translation service, what have you. There's a major organization in Seattle called Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, and we collaborate with them. There was a recent initiative, for example, where the Biden administration decided that a way of addressing the thousands of people that were stuck at the border. So I don't know if you remember this, but during the Trump administration, there was a policy called Stay in Place, where instead of coming to the United States and having your asylum case processed, you had to remain in Mexico while someone eventually got around to talking to you. And the Biden administration response was, let's bring all these people in, let's send them to one of 10 cities, and let's put them on an expedited court docket. And so I was in on a conversation with Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, the component of the Washington State chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. And we were talking about strategies about how to handle this influx of additional clients. KIAC is also a member of the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, which is a national umbrella organization. They provide us with support and training. We were also tied into the Washington New Americas program, which is an offshoot of One America, where we got to interface and interact with other grantees of that program. So you bet, we're tied in to the extent we can be. There's some local attorneys I refer work to who have grants to do work for special immigrant juvenile cases. I've had conversations with the Kitsap County Bar Association about trying to get pro bono counsel to do work. Everyone's tapped. It's hard. But yeah, you bet. If we can refer out a case or someone calls us from out of area, really outside our geographical jurisdiction that we feel comfortable taking, we'll refer them to the extent we can.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
For a second? So when I think about KIAC, we have three primary programs. So we have legal services, which Larry is our director of, and then family services, which Annika is our director of, and then our tax and business service line. And what Larry was speaking to was organizations that we partner with specifically and especially for legal services, although some of our family services does that too. But one thing that I was most impressed about with KIAC when I joined the team last August was the hub-like nature that KIAC is and has in this community. Annika's team never seeks to reinvent the wheel. There's so many great organizations doing really good work here in Kitsap County. And what we do is partner with them, see what services they provide, find out how their services can be more accessible to the people that we serve, and then build those relationships and those partnerships so that our clients feel safe seeking services in our partner organizations. So we have a lot of non-immigrant specific partnerships within this community and beyond. And I think just kind of the unique nature of KIAC is that we've built those relationships and those partnerships. We're advocating for their accessibility, and we're kind of keeping everything under the KIAC umbrella while pulling in other organizations.
And it is a testament to KIAC standing within the community that we are often the first place that people come to when they need assistance, whether it's legal, help paying a bill, a medical bill, or get medical services for that matter, dental, checkups, diapers. They come to KIAC first. And if we can move the needle or move them down the road to another organization, we will.
Question about the visa process. Are these visas that have a expiration date?
This question is just asking if these visas have an expiration date.
So the visas that most people are looking for are permanent visas. And so here's a pretend visa. And in the old days, we would have the visa. If you're coming, they would put it in your passport. Here's my visa, here's my passport. And in the United States, to make it easier so you don't have to carry your passport around, they pull out the visa and put it in a card. And it's called a green card because back in the day, it's actually green again. But back in the day, it used to be green, and then it went to pink and yellow, and now it's green again. So that's where the term green card comes from. So green card is a permanent visa. Permanent visa gives you the privilege and the right to live and work in the United States on a permanent basis. So there is, by definition, no expiration to that period of stay. It is a permanent visa. Now, you can do things to lose that visa. You can commit a crime. You can abandon your green card if you decide, I want to go back home and live there for the next 5 years. If you live overseas for a certain amount of time, you can relinquish that status because the purpose of that green card is to live in the United States. If you're not living in the United States, the US government can take the position that you don't need this green card, which is an issue that has come up during COVID, where people go overseas, they get trapped overseas. Oh, I only went for a vacation and I couldn't get back on a plane. They wouldn't let me back on a plane. I got stuck in a pandemic ravaged area. I couldn't come home. And then they get stuck outside the country, and then they have to face these questions about whether or not they've abandoned their status. Now, there is a logistical part of the green card, which if you look at it, in the old days, the green cards didn't have an expiration date on them. But nowadays they do. They're typically good for 10 years, sometimes in some cases only 2 years. And there is a renewal process that you have to go through in order to get that piece of plastic or that card up to date, kind of like going through a driver's license process. So if your green card expires facially, it doesn't mean that you're not a permanent resident anymore. Just like if your ATM card, if anyone even uses those anymore, your ATM card expires, the money's still in the bank, you just have a harder time accessing your funds.
I think we see no more questions. Do you agree? Are there any more questions? If not, I want to thank you, Larry Chen, very much, and you for Kimberly for your participation in this program. And I think we've all come away with a really good feeling for KIAC. And I know I have a much better understanding of both KIAC and the immigration law. Thank you again very much.
My pleasure. Want more information about KIAC? We have some handouts here. A little bit of a description of what we've done in the last 6 months of this year.